on the screen, but maybe it's a little easier to read. Plus, this is just one of the best slides to illustrate the genealogy that we deal with throughout the Old Testament. It gives you all of the patriarchs, their children, and where you can find it. So I just thought it was a very good visual representation of a lot of the things that we read about in the Old Testament. I'm sorry. You were supposed to be first. Okay, did I miss anyone else? Okay. Oop. Yeah. You want to do the microphone too, Alan? Alan? Since you volunteered. Okay. Would you bow with me now as we begin our class? Father, we come before you this morning. We have so many names from this congregation that are on our hearts and minds for health issues. Some former members that are just facing serious problems. We ask that you be with all of them and their families and their caretakers and just guide them through these trying times. Be with us now as we study your word. It's through Jesus that we pray. Amen. I had a couple of questions last week after class. One of them had to do with how do I study ahead for what you are going to be doing next week? That one kind of stumped me because I have an idea of how we're going to do this. When we first started talking about doing a review of the Old Testament, I found a book that divided the Old Testament into 25 epochs. Well, 25, 2 a week, we can do it. But when I start going through it, I always find something that I want to deal with, I want to talk about. And that happens even week to week. So I'm sorry, but I really don't know how to tell you to study about what we're going to be doing, except look at the Old Testament. We're reviewing it. Second question had to do with the promise made to Ishmael. And I got to thinking about that, and you know, the Old Testament generally has to do with promises made and fulfilled. And we have talked about 3 of those. The promise made to Abraham that's passed down through his sons, Isaac and Jacob. That's the part that we study all the time, and that's generally what we're going to be looking at through the Old Testament. But he also makes a promise to Ishmael and to Esau. So I thought this morning, the first thing we'd do is look at those 2 promises in relation to Old Testament fulfillment and perhaps even impact that they have on today's world. So if you would, get your Bibles, turn to Genesis 16. This is the first promise that we see that's made to Ishmael. Now, Ishmael is the son of Abraham and Sarah's handmaiden, Hagar. And here, Sarah has been mistreating Hagar, and she runs away and leaves, and she's out in the wilderness, and things aren't looking good. And God comes to her. And in verse 10, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are with child, you shall bear a son, you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. and he shall dwell in the presence of all of his brethren. So that's the first time that we see this. He's going to be a great nation. He's going to have lots of descendants. Let's skip over to chapter 17. We'll begin reading in 15. Then God said to Abraham, "As for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name, and I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. And then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her." Now that's the promise made to Abraham and Sarah's son. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who's 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Here Abraham is asking God to take care of Ishmael. Then God said, "No, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant for him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation." So the question is, when is that fulfilled? When do the Ishmaelites become a great nation? If we go through the Old Testament, we just don't see a lot of interaction between the Ishmaelites and the Israelites. They don't appear to be a powerful people. In Psalms 83, there's a listing of, 10 or 11 nations that are constantly in conflict with the Israelites, and the Ishmaelites are listed there. But that's one of the few times that you see the Ishmaelites. So when are they a great nation? If you look on your sheet or up here, you'll see that Hagar and Ishmael have those 12 princes that are mentioned. That's one option. There are 12 princes listed, and I suppose that could be the equivalent of the 12 sons of Jacob. The other option that we have is to look forward to today. I'm going to throw out some numbers here that obviously are wild guesses, but if you start looking at them, all the places that you look to try to find an answer to the question will be somewhat the same. Abraham has approximately a little less than half of the world's population that consider him a key figure in their religious heritage. Now think about that. Half the world's population. It's around, last numbers I saw, 7 million people, 7 billion people. Over 2 million of those, the good news is that over 2 million of them follow the left-hand side here. They are so-called Christian. If you count all affiliated Christian, so-called Christian religions, Catholics, all the way down, a little over 2 billion people that consider themselves living in a Christian nation, if you will. Maybe that's a better way to put it. There's over 1.5 billion that consider themselves to be descendants religiously of Ishmael. Think about that. Half the world's population vying over that few acres that we call Jerusalem and the Temple Mount today. Kind of horrifying when you think about the potential that could be there. It's a difficult situation. And one of the things that I looked at, and I won't say I completed it, but as you go through the Old Testament, you don't see any of the offspring of Ishmael combining. They're constantly not only fighting against the Israelites, but they're fighting against each other. And they still are today. Kind of frightening if you think about what would happen if they really truly combined forces. Anyway, that's the Ishmael story. Now let's go look at the Esau side. Go to Genesis 27. And we'll read really starting in verse 39. No, let's go to 29 first. This is when Jacob is getting by trickery the blessing of his father. Surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. So the question, when do his mother's sons bow down to him? When does Esau bow down to Jacob? Now let's look at Esau's. That's in verse 39. Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth, and the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck. Second question, when does Esau break the yoke of his brother's oppression? And in this case, we have a great deal of information in the Old Testament about the conflict between the Israelites and the Edomites. Esau's descendants are referred to in three different ways. Generally, they're called the Edomites, but they can also be called Mount Seir. If we look at when Jacob and Esau meet, Esau eventually retreats to Mount Seir, which he makes as his home. So we'll see some instances in the Old Testament where the Edomites are referred to as Mount Seir, and we'll look at that in just a minute in Ezekiel. And also when we get to later times, in Jesus' time, the Edomites are referred to as Idumeans. And that's also kind of an important distinction that we'll look at the end of this. But when do the sons bow down? When do the sons of Esau bow down to the sons of Jacob? We see the first example that we see in the Old Testament is in Numbers chapter 20 and Judges chapter 11, when the people are still in the wilderness. They're wandering. They have not yet made it to the promised land. They want to go through Edom. The Edomites refuse, and even post an army to keep them from doing it. That is the first time that we see conflict between the two. Let's go to 2 Samuel 8. Second Samuel 8:13. And David made himself a name when he returned from killing 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of the Salt. He also put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord preserved David wherever he went. That is the only time that I'm familiar with that I could find where the Edomites bowed down or served the Israelites. We see there are many conflicts. We see other times where the Edomites are defeated by the Israelites, but we don't really see any place where they served them except here in 2 Samuel. So that resolves one question, is when did they bow down? So when did they break the yoke? Here they're subservient. When is the yoke broken? Let's go to 2 Kings 3. The situation here is that Moab has been paying tribute to the king of Israel, or to the southern kingdom, king of Judah. He refuses. So the king of Judah, we'll look at verse 9. So the king of Israel went with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. An extraordinarily interesting passage. This obviously is after the kingdoms have divided. Here we see the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom combining armies for a common cause. We don't see that very often. They're also combining with the king of Edom. Edom certainly has broken the yoke, and they now have their own king. So we saw previously where they were strong enough to prohibit the Israelites from passing. Then they served them. Now they have their own king. Okay. Now let's look at let's go to Ezekiel. There's some more parts to this story. Ezekiel chapter 35. And in my Bible, it has as a heading for this chapter, Judgment on Mount Seir. Now remember that we talked about Mount Seir being another name for Edomites. Behold, O Mount Seir, I am against you. I will stretch out my hand against you. I will make you most desolate. I shall lay your cities waste. And in verse 5, because you have had an ancient hatred and have shed the blood of the children of Israel by the power of the sword at the time of their calamity. Now, what we need to think about and try to understand is, what is he talking about? What is the time of their calamity? Verse 10, because you have said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess them. The two countries that he has in mind here are the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Edom has its sight on taking over the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. the total of what we call Israel. Verse 12, then you shall know that I am the Lord. I have heard all your blasphemies which you have spoken against the mountain of Israel, saying, they are desolate, they are given to us to consume. They are looking at the situation that's evolving and saying it's to their advantage that we're going to consume them. Verse 14, thus says the Lord God, the whole earth will rejoice when I make you desolate. As you rejoice because the inheritance of the house of Israel was desolate, so I will do to you. You shall be desolate, O Mount Seir, as well as all of Edom, all of it. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. So what situation is he talking about here? Turn to the book of Obadiah. Obadiah is a unique book in the sense that it is written really to a nation other than Israel. The first 9 verses of that is talking about how the Israelites, or how Edom is going to be punished. In verse 10, it starts talking about why they are going to be punished. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you. You shall be cut off forever in the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were one of them. Now, if you just started looking at this, didn't know where it was from, you would kind of think it was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But it's not. It's written well before that. Verse 12, but you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress. He's talking about a period of time when Edom actually captured Israelites that were escaping this calamity. They killed some of them. Others they turned over to the invading army. Now, this is the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in the year 587. At that point, Edom looked upon this as an opportunity to take over the Israelite lands. They assisted in that. They captured some of the people that were escaping. So the question here is, Obadiah is prophesying that the Edomites will be destroyed just like the Israelites. So when did that occur? When were the Edomites finally destroyed? We talked about it a little bit when we last met. During the last part of the Greek occupation, we went through the sequence of the Babylonians destroyed the temple. They were succeeded by the Medes and the Persians, were succeeded by the Greeks, then the Romans. In the last part of the Greek occupation, things got so bad that the Jews revolted and it's called The Maccabean Revolt. I have a book that Connie found. It's called Understanding the Maccabean Revolt. I would recommend that if you're interested in this whatsoever, this is a great book. It is written by 3 Jewish scholars, and they differ a little bit, and I'll get to that in just a minute, from some things that I have always read and always taught about this. We don't talk about this, we don't think about this, mainly because the fulfillment of this is not specifically listed in the Old Testament. We see the prophecy regarding it, but we don't see the fulfillment. The entire basis for this book comes from the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is a collection of old writings that the scholars that put together the New Testament, or the Bible, did not regard as trustworthy enough to be included. But it is still an enormously important part of history. And the end of the Maccabean revolt, the Maccabees had grown sufficiently strong that they utterly destroyed Edom. Now, typically, most of the books, most of the deals, and I suspect if you have a study Bible, this will be in there in some of the footnotes, that the Edomites were forcibly converted to Judaism, i.e. circumcision. These guys suggest that's not the case, that yes, they were defeated, the Edomites were defeated, but that they willingly converted to Judaism. There's one more chapter in the story of the Edomites that's interesting. King Herod, that was ruler over Judah when Jesus was born and was trying to kill all of the babies, was an Edomite. Now, that's something that you know it, and you've known it for years, and in preparing for this, I started trying to find in the Bible where it says that Herod was an Edomite, and I couldn't find it. I think that is a history, but it certainly has been confirmed. It's serious type history that Herod was an Edomite. So Jesus was born into a world in which his area was ruled by arch enemies, the Edomites. The Herod of Jesus' birth died not too long after, and it was split up to three of his sons. But interesting stories. The Bible fits together. You see these prophecies, you can chase them down, and they all tie together. Okay.
This is a simple question from a simple person. I understand Isaac and his offspring, the purpose, etc. I have never understood the others, the Edomites. I never understood why they even came into existence. I guess there's got to be a reason for it. Maybe it was the opposition to the Jews that made the Jews persevere. Perhaps that was part of it, I don't know. But
I understand the one of the things that comes to mind when, and I thought about that same thing. Why? The old, oh, you got more?
I don't have an answer to that. But I was just going to say later, at the destruction of Jerusalem, is it turned on?
Yeah, it's on. Just get it up close to
Oh,
you.
okay. At the destruction of Jerusalem, the Edomites, or the Idumeans, were actually called upon to come in and help the people who were doing all the destruction at the temple.
Yeah.
When they looked around, they found out that it wasn't the Jewish leaders that were causing the trouble, so they turned around and went back out. So they're still kind of there in a fringe element, at least, way down at the destruction in 70 AD.
Yeah. I don't have a good answer, but one of the largest overriding messages that we get, especially from the Old Testament, is that God is the God of all nations, not just those who believe in Him. And He frequently uses non-believing nations to punish believing nations. So, and the Edomites were a constant harassment against the Jews from beginning to end. And in both cases, when Abraham died and when Isaac died, his sons got together and buried him. We don't really see, in either case, conflict between the two, except when Esau was angry enough to kill Jacob at the very beginning, and Jacob ran away. When they came back, Esau was very gracious, or when Jacob returned to his country, Jacob was very forgiving, very humble, with no conflict or no obvious harboring of bad feelings. But his descendants certainly did. Was it jealousy? When they, in Numbers 20, when they were first, had their first conflict, Edom was a large nation already. They controlled this land. They did not want any interlopers in there. So, I don't have a good answer. Good question, I guess. Anything else on that? Okay, Ralph Scott. It's just, to me, this is the relationship between those two groups of people is fascinating.
You can't be good unless you got something to offset and show that you can be a good person. If someone leaves a wallet somewhere, you don't take it, you turn it in. There's always has to be something, I think, to give you an opportunity to make the right choice. Edom had a choice, and they went the other direction. They followed the path of jealousy and anger, seeking what they thought their own justice and their rights, how they were passed over by the things that Jacob got and his descendants. And sometimes people let that stuff eat at them, and they they aren't able to overcome. But I think a lot of these things happened to give people the opportunity to do the right thing. And it's like when we were reading about in Obadiah how the Edomites, corralled the escaping Israelites and sent them back into Nebuchadnezzar. They sit there and they were glad. Hey, and God detested that. So they had an opportunity to do one or two things, to help or to hinder. They chose to hinder. It's the same thing for all of us. We have the opportunity to help or to hinder, to promote God, promote Christ, or not. Sitting on the sidelines and letting everything go by, not going to cut it. It didn't matter whether it was in the days of these people or our days. These are lessons that the Old Testament teaches us and things we need to think of and do.
Good point. Good point. Anything else? Speaking of sitting on the sidelines, the reason that Rome appointed Herod as ruler over Judah was that his family supported Rome when they were coming in and taking over. And I mention that because if you get this little book, it talks about how Edomites in general fought Rome, were not supportive, and were trying to keep them out. But one family, the Herod family, supported Rome. Anything else? Let's think for just a minute. I'm going to break from the history that I've been trying to follow. The book of Job is believed to be, or Job is believed to have lived sometime during the patriarchal or immediately following patriarchal, because of his lifestyle and his knowledge of God. And we study Job a lot, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. So I'm not going to spend any time really about the true lessons of Job being an example of how we are to live in times of adversity. But I would like to just think about Job a little bit in terms of history and where he could or should fit. And that's going to be a lead-in into Exodus. It's not just an exercise here. Job had a lifestyle that was quite similar to the patriarchal period. He was a strong man of his time. His wealth was measured in cattle, livestock. Other than that, well, we know that he was a man from the east. Some believe that means simply east of the Jordan. Others believed over into Mesopotamia. But can you think of any other individual in the Bible that is similar to Job in that he has the nomadic lifestyle, or wealth is measured in livestock, and he also has at least some knowledge of God, and yet he's pretty much an unknown character? Well, the first thought that I had in trying to go through that exercise was Melchizedek. We just don't know anything about Melchizedek. But he apparently believed in God. The other person that seems quite similar to me is Moses' father-in-law, Jethro. He was described as a prince of Midian. His wealth was measured in livestock, and he knew something about God. He was the prince of Midian. Just think about that as we're going through. And as far as I'm concerned, we finished really 3 books this morning in the Old Testament: Obadiah, Job, and Genesis. Okay? I've got a handout here. Get Steve and Alan to just while they're handing those out, just a quick review. We know that Moses was saved from death. First, babies were to be killed by the midwives. That didn't work, so the Egyptians themselves were going to cast the newborn babies into the river, because that Pharaoh believed that the people were becoming more and mightier than he. We know that as we get them out of Egypt into Mount Sinai, they have a census. There's over 600,000 men. So they are becoming a formidable force. Moses was provided an excellent education until he was 40 years old. He was raised in Pharaoh's house. He killed an Egyptian. He escaped to Midian. He acquired a family. And there he was called by God to return to Egypt and lead the people out. And he was given the ability to perform signs and miracles, not only to convince Pharaoh, but also to convince the Egyptian people that he was truly sent by God. They have the 10 plagues, and what I handed out, or what the guys handed out to you, is you won't find this in any of the literature. This is something that was put together for the Bible Bowl effort this year. It lists, and Lori did this, so when you see her, tell her how great she did, because this is, I think, fantastic. It lists all of the plagues, how they were performed, the results, and the timing. If somebody ever tells you that, well, these were all natural events, you can go take this and go through, and they were foretold. Even at one time, Pharaoh was given the option of deciding when the plague would end. Magicians duplicated. Some cases, the Israelites were not affected. The response, and the scriptures, so that you can go and look that up. I'm not going to go through those. I think they were some of the major events in history. But you can take this, and that's a good piece of paper to stick in a file somewhere, and you have everything about the plagues at your fingertips. Give you a few minutes to look that over and see if you have any questions, and then, if you would, turn to Exodus chapter 12. I'm sorry, I want to start in chapter 8. Is everybody in Exodus chapter 8? This is during the 4th plague. Moses has asked that they be able to go into the wilderness so that they could sacrifice to God. In verse 25, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, and so, go sacrifice to your God in the land. And Moses said, it is not right to do so, for we would be sacrificing the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. If we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, then will they not stone us? We really don't know much, if anything, about what kind of a relationship the Israelites had with God when they were in Egypt. If you look at this, apparently they had not been sacrificing. There is some indication that they were practicing circumcision, because we see when Moses begins his trip from Midian to Egypt that he and his wife have a confrontation about circumcision. So there may be some evidence that they at least did that. But there's not much evidence that they did anything else. Here it seems like that they couldn't sacrifice because the Egyptians would take offense to it and stone them. And I say that for you to think about the background that these people had as they go forward out of Egypt. In just over a year from the time they leave Egypt, they are going to be a fully formed nation where God has transformed himself from basically the God of the patriarchs to God of the individuals. He's going to be living among them. They're going to make a promise to them, or they're going to agree individually to abide by the covenant, which is, we haven't seen that before. For the individual to be so totally immersed in a religion. And they're going to be transformed from slaves to a nation without a country in a year. Again, we don't know precisely what their relationship with God was when they were in Egypt. I'm going to try to skip ahead here. Look at chapter 12. This is where the Passover is instituted. The individuals are going to have a number of things that they do. This month, in the chapter 12, verse 1. This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. This is going to be such an important event in their history that they're going to start their calendar from this time. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small, and I'm not going to read all of this, but this is the first time in the Bible that we see an organized feast worship by the people, not by heads of household. Okay. We'll take up there and we'll go through Mount Sinai next time.